They said his hands were too dirty to touch anything that belonged to real money. By sundown, those same hands would sign the papers that owned the yacht he'd been fixing. Before we get into this one, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and tap the like. Stories like this are just getting started on this channel. Marcus Doyle had grease under his fingernails that never fully came out, not even after 20 years. He kept a small marine repair shop at the edge of Cedar Point Marina, South Carolina, a place where the docks creaked louder than the seagulls and the paint on the sign out front, Doyle's Marine Repair, had faded from red to a tired pink. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way men get when the world has taught them that talking too much invites trouble. His mother had raised him alone in a two-bedroom house behind a laundromat until the cancer took her when he was 19. After that, it had just been him, a toolbox his uncle left behind, and a stubborn refusal to ask anybody for anything he couldn't pay back. He had built the shop up from nothing, starting with outboard motors on rowboats, then moving to sailboats, then finally to the big private yachts that came through Cedar Point every summer, owned by people who flew in from Charleston and Savannah, and sometimes farther, people who tipped in cash and never remembered his name twice. Marcus didn't mind. He wasn't there to be remembered. He was there to fix what was broken and go home. That particular Thursday morning, the call came in from the Marina office. A yacht called the Corinthian Grace had thrown a fault in her port engine overnight, some kind of electrical short that was making the whole propulsion system stutter, and the owners wanted it fixed before noon because they had guests arriving for a weekend cruise down to Hilton Head. Marcus loaded his tools into the back of his truck, a rust-spotted Ford that had outlived 3 transmissions, and drove the 15 minutes to the private dock where the big boats stayed. He'd never seen the Corinthian Grace up close before. She was enormous, nearly 110 feet of gleaming white hull and dark-tinted glass, with a helicopter pad folded flush against her stern deck and a name painted in gold script, so polished it looked wet. Marcus whistled low under his breath, the way he always did at real craftsmanship, whether it belonged to him or not. A boat like that wasn't just money. It was decades of engineering, a small city's worth of systems, all humming together. He respected it the way he respected anything built with care. A young man in a Marina polo shirt met him at the gangway. "You the mechanic?" "Marcus Doyle. Got a call about an engine fault. They're expecting somebody in coveralls, not exactly expecting company today, so try to keep it quick," the young man said, not unkindly, just tired. "Family's up on the sun deck. Try not to bother them." Marcus nodded and went to work. He climbed down into the engine room through a hatch near the stern, and the moment he laid his hands on the wiring harness for the port engine, something in him settled the way it always did. Whatever was wrong with the world up above deck, down here it was just voltage and current and the plain honest logic of machines. He found the short within 20 minutes. A chafe cable where it ran too close to a hot exhaust manifold. Insulation worn clean through by months of vibration nobody had bothered to inspect. Careless work by whoever had serviced this boat last. Rich people's toys, Marcus thought, often got the cheapest labor because nobody expected the owners to actually look under the deck plates. He was halfway through splicing in a new run of cable when he heard footsteps on the ladder behind him. Quick and irritated, high heels clicking against aluminum rungs in a way that told him the person climbing down had never done it before and resented having to learn. "Excuse me, are you almost done? We have people arriving in an hour, and this whole boat smells like diesel." Marcus turned his head. A young woman stood at the base of the ladder, maybe 26, 27, dressed like she'd stepped out of a yacht club catalog. White linen pants, gold sandals, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly cost more than his truck. She was looking at him the way you'd look at a stain on a white couch. "Almost, ma'am. Just finishing the splice, then I've got to test the circuit. You've got grease on the carpet runner." She said it flatly, like a fact of weather. Marcus glanced down. There was, in fact, a small smudge near the hatch where his boot had tracked through. "I'll clean that up before I leave." "See that you do." She turned to go, then paused, looking him over once more. The faded coveralls with Doyle's Marine Repair stitched crooked over the breast pocket, the sweat on his collar, the gray already showing at his temples though he wasn't yet 40. "What's your name?" "Marcus." "Well, Marcus, when you're finished, use the crew gangway on the port side. My father doesn't like tradesmen using the main gangway when guests are boarding. It doesn't look right." She said it the way someone gives directions to a bathroom, already halfway up the ladder before she finished the sentence. Marcus said nothing. He'd heard some version of that sentence more times than he could count over the years, from marina managers, from clients' assistants, from people who didn't think twice about drawing a line between the deck where the guests stood and the hatch where the workers climbed. It never stopped stinging exactly, but he'd learned a long time ago that a man who let every sting knock him off balance never got anything fixed. He finished the splice, tested the circuit, watched the port engine come alive smooth, and even on the little diagnostic screen, and packed up his tools. Keep a lower public profile than most people in my position would, though I've stopped hiding it from the people actually in my life, which turns out to matter more than I understood for 11 years. I remarried nothing. Not yet. Not soon. Maybe not ever. And that's fine. That's a chapter I'm not in a hurry to write. What I did instead, in the years since that night at Gate C4, he was coiling the last extension cord when a heavy-set man in a captain's polo, not the actual captain, Marcus would learn, but the family's estate manager, a man named Pruitt, came down and looked over the work with a critical eye, the way men who know nothing about engines like to look at things they don't understand. "This gonna hold?" Pruitt asked. "It'll hold. Whoever wired it originally ran the cable too close to the manifold. I rerouted it and added a heat shield. Shouldn't give you trouble again." "Good. Invoice the office." Pruitt didn't say thank you. He said it the way you'd dismiss a delivery driver, and Marcus, tools in hand, made his way toward the stern, intending to use the crew gangway just like he'd been told, because that was easier than making a thing out of it. He didn't make it that far. At the top of the aft stairs, he came face to face with an older man, silver-haired, deeply tanned, dressed in a blazer despite the June heat, the kind of man whose posture alone told you he expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. This, Marcus would later learn, was Harold Whitfield, patriarch of the Whitfield shipping fortune, owner of the Corinthian Grace, and father to the young woman who'd complained about the carpet. Whitfield looked at Marcus's coveralls, at the toolbox in his hand, at the grease on his forearms, and his mouth curled in something that wasn't quite a sneer, but lived right next door to one. "You're the repairman." "Yes, sir. All finished with the port engine." "Good. My guests are arriving in 40 minutes, and I don't want them seeing a repairman wandering my deck like he owns the place." Whitfield said it loud enough for two crew members nearby to hear, loud enough that a few heads on the dock below turned. "Take the service stairs down. And in the future, have the marina schedule your work before 8 in the morning. I don't pay for a 110-foot yacht to smell like a garage when my company arrives." There it was again, that particular tone people used when they'd never once had to wonder if they belonged somewhere. Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck, not anger exactly, something older and more tired than anger, the kind of feeling a man carries for 20 years of being looked past. He kept his voice even. "Yes, sir. Have a good afternoon." He walked down the service stairs, past the young woman. Her name was Delphine Whitfield, he'd learn later, though at that moment she was just the girl with gold sandals, who was directing caterers with sharp little hand gestures, not sparing him a second glance. He crossed the crew gangway onto the dock, loaded his tools into his truck, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, doing what he always did after moments like this, breathing slow, letting it pass through him instead of settling into his chest. He had a shop to run. He had a daughter, 12 years old, sharp as anything, waiting for him to pick her up from summer camp at 4 o'clock, and he wasn't going to let a man in a blazer ruin either of their afternoons. What Harold Whitfield did not know, what nobody at Cedar Point Marina knew, because Marcus had never once mentioned it to anyone outside his own lawyer's office, was that 6 weeks earlier, Marcus Doyle had signed the final paperwork on a deal that had been 18 months in the making. Marcus Doyle, mechanic, owner of a small marine repair shop with grease permanently ground into the lines of his palms, was also, as of that signing, the majority owner of Belhaven Maritime Holdings, the parent company that had just acquired Sovereign Yacht Group, the very shipbuilder and management firm that serviced, insured, and held the mortgage note on the Corinthian Grace. If you're wondering how a small-town mechanic ends up owning the company that holds the paper on a 110-foot yacht, stay with this one, because the answer is the whole reason we're here. And if a story like that interests you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss where this goes. The truth of it went back 9 years, to a night Marcus rarely talked about. He'd been working as a diesel mechanic for a commercial fishing outfit back then, barely scraping by. His wife 2 years gone from a heart condition nobody caught in time. Raising his daughter Renee on his own while trying to keep the lights on. A hurricane had come through the Carolina coast that September. Hurricane Odell, a storm the news had underestimated until it was nearly on top of them. And half the boats in the marina where he worked had been left unsecured because the marina's absentee owner, a man drowning in his own debts, had skipped town rather than pay for storm prep. Marcus had stayed alone. In the wind and the rising water, he'd spent 14 hours lashing down boats that weren't his, hauling anchor lines through waist-deep surge, because he knew that if those vessels broke loose, they'd become battering rams that could take out the whole dock, the fuel station, maybe the houses beyond the seawall. One of those boats, a modest 32-footer he'd fought hardest to save, wading out twice into water that nearly took him under, belonged to a quiet, unassuming older man named Elias Reyes, who Marcus had never met before that night and assumed was just another local with a fishing boat. Elias Reyes was not just another local. He was the founder and, at the time, sole owner of Sovereign Yacht Group, a company that built and managed luxury vessels for clients up and down the eastern seaboard. A company that, ironically, the Corinthian Grace's own hull had been built by 12 years earlier. Reyes had been going through a quiet, humbling stretch of his own life back then, recovering from a divorce that had gutted half his fortune, living modestly on that little boat while he rebuilt, telling no one who he was. He'd watched Marcus, exhausted and bleeding from a gash on his forearm where a snapped line had whipped back at him, refused to stop working even after Reyes told him the boat wasn't worth risking his life for. "It's just a boat," Reyes had shouted over the wind. "Get out of the water." "It's somebody's boat," Marcus had shouted back. "Everything out here belongs to somebody who worked for it. I'm not letting the storm just take it because nobody else showed up." Reyes never forgot that sentence. He tracked Marcus down 2 days after the storm, once the water receded and the town started counting what it had lost, and found him back at the marina already, sunburned and exhausted, helping other boat owners assess the damage without being asked. Reyes offered him money. Marcus turned it down, said he didn't do it for pay, said the marina had already reimbursed him fair wages for his hours. Reyes offered him a job at Sovereign. Marcus turned that down too, gently, because his daughter was young and he didn't want to uproot her, and because, though he never said this part out loud, he liked being his own boss, liked the shop he was slowly building at Cedar Point, liked answering to nobody but his customers and his conscience. What Marcus accepted, eventually, after years of Reyes quietly checking in, sending him referrals, occasionally stopping by the shop just to talk boats and drink bad coffee, was something neither of them called a debt, though it functioned like one on both sides. When Reyes decided, at 71, that it was time to step back from Sovereign and find the right person to eventually take on real ownership, someone who understood boats not as status symbols, but as things built by hands and kept alive by care, he didn't go to venture capital firms or competing shipbuilders. He went to Marcus. It had taken Marcus a long time to say yes. He wasn't chasing money. Lord knows the shop paid the bills and let him coach Renee's softball team on weekends. And that had always felt like enough. But Reyes made the case slowly, over 2 years of dinners and phone calls, that Sovereign needed someone at the top who remembered what it felt like to be the person nobody thanked, the person expected to use the service stairs. "You keep this company honest," Reyes told him once, "just by being the kind of man who wades into a hurricane for a stranger's boat and doesn't take the reward. I need that kind of person owning this, not managing it under somebody who'll sell it to whoever offers the highest number." So Marcus had structured the deal quietly through Belhaven Maritime Holdings, a company he set up specifically so his own name would stay off the public paperwork while the transaction closed. Both because he didn't want the attention and because, if he was honest with himself, some old instinct told him it would be useful, someday, to know exactly how people treated him when they thought he had nothing. He hadn't expected to find out the same month the deal closed. He hadn't expected it to happen on a boat his own company now effectively controlled through the shipbuilder's servicing contract and the outstanding notes Sovereign held on it. But there it was. What would you do if you were in Marcus's position, humiliated by someone who had no idea who you actually were? Would you say something right there on the deck, or would you wait? Let us know in the comments, because Marcus made his choice, and it wasn't the one most people expect. He picked up Renee from camp at 4 o'clock like he always did, and if she noticed her father was a little quieter than usual on the drive home, she didn't say anything, just told him about the archery lesson she'd had and the friendship bracelet she was making him, purple and gray, his favorite colors, even though he'd never once told her that. She'd just noticed, the way sharp kids notice everything. He tied it around his wrist that night and didn't take it off. He almost let the whole thing go. That was the truth of it. Marcus wasn't a man who went looking for confrontation, and some small, tired part of him wanted to just let Harold Whitfield exist in his little bubble of blazers and gold script nameplates, forever unaware, while Marcus went back to his shop and his daughter and his quiet life. But two things happened over the following week that changed his mind. The first was a phone call from Denise Ashworth, the general manager Sovereign had installed to run day-to-day operations while Marcus settled into his new role as majority owner. A sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd worked under Elias Reyes for over a decade and had exactly zero patience for entitled clients. She called Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight with barely contained frustration. "We've got a problem with the Whitfield account," she said. "Harold Whitfield's behind on his servicing payments, nearly 4 months now, and his estate manager's been stalling our billing department with excuses. Meanwhile, he's got the nerve to be calling and demanding an emergency haul-out and hull inspection before some regatta next month, free of charge, threatening to take his business to a competitor if we don't comply. Given the balance he owes, legally we're within our rights to hold the vessel until the account's settled." Marcus sat with that information for a long moment. How much does he owe? A little over $210,000 across servicing, dockage through our marina partners, and the outstanding balance on refit work we did on that yacht 18 months ago. He's been treating our invoices like suggestions. And the crew? The captain, the deckhands, the folks actually working the boat. Paid through Whitfield's household account separately, from what I understand. This is specifically Whitfield stalling Sovereign directly. Marcus thought about the young woman in gold sandals complaining about a grease smudge on carpet that, as it turned out, her own father hadn't fully paid for. He thought about Harold Whitfield's voice carrying across the deck, loud enough for the dock to hear, telling a repairman to use the service stairs like it owned the man. "Send him the formal notice," Marcus said. 30 days to settle the account, or we exercise our lien rights on the vessel and the servicing contract lapses. Standard language, nothing personal in the tone. Just make sure it's airtight. You got it. And Marcus, you want your name on the notice, or should it go out under mine, like usual? Marcus almost said keep it under yours, the way he always did, the way he'd done with every transaction since the deal closed, content to stay the quiet owner nobody needed to picture. Then he thought about it a moment longer. "Put both names on it," he said. "Mine and yours." The second thing that happened was smaller, but it mattered more. 3 days after the notice went out, Marcus got a call directly to the shop. Not to Bellhaven, not to Sovereign's corporate line, but to Doyle's Marine Repair, the little pink-painted shop at Cedar Point that Harold Whitfield's people had pulled the number for off the marina's referral list. It was Delphine Whitfield on the line, her voice noticeably different than it had been on the deck of the Corinthian Grace, thinner, a little unsteady. "Is this Marcus? The mechanic who worked on our engine last week. This is Marcus. My father's yacht is having engine trouble again, and he's refusing to call the company that services it because of some billing dispute, and I don't understand any of it. I just know we've got guests coming this weekend and nobody in his office will explain what's actually going on, and you're the only outside repairman who's ever actually been down in that engine room. So I thought maybe you could just come take a look, quietly, before it becomes a whole thing." Marcus almost smiled, alone in his shop, wrench still in hand from the outboard motor he'd been working on. There was something almost funny about it. The same young woman who'd told him to use the crew gangway, now calling his shop directly, hoping he'd quietly fix a problem her own father had created by refusing to pay the company Marcus now owned. "Miss Whitfield," he said, keeping his voice even, "I appreciate the call, but I did that repair as a contractor working through Sovereign Yacht Group's Marina Referral Network. Any further work on that engine has to go through them directly. It's a liability issue, insurance, all of it. I can't just show up and do side work on a vessel under an active servicing contract. Can't you make an exception? You seemed, I don't know, you seemed like you actually knew what you were doing, unlike whoever my father usually deals with." Marcus paused. There was an opening there, and he took it, gently. Miss Whitfield, has your father told you why sovereigns decline to send anyone out? A silence on the line. No. He just says it's a misunderstanding with the billing department, and he's handling it. It might be worth asking him directly what he owes them. Might save you some trouble this weekend. He heard her exhale, frustrated, though not at him exactly. This is ridiculous. I'm sorry to have bothered you. She hung up before he could say anything else. That conversation stayed with Marcus longer than he expected. There'd been something underneath Delphine Whitfield's clipped, entitled tone that day on the deck. Something he hadn't clocked at the time because he'd been too busy absorbing the sting of it. But that came back to him now. She hadn't been cruel exactly. She'd been careless, the particular carelessness of someone who'd never once had to think about how her words landed on people who couldn't afford to push back. That was different from cruelty, though it could look the same. From the outside, and it mattered to Marcus, a little, which one he was actually dealing with. He didn't have long to wonder. 10 days after the formal notice went out, Sovereign's legal team informed Marcus that Harold Whitfield still hadn't settled the account. And worse, they discovered something uglier buried in the paperwork. Whitfield had been quietly shopping the Corinthian Grace to a private buyer through a broker, planning to sell the vessel out from under the outstanding servicing lien and the refit financing Sovereign held, essentially trying to walk away from the debt entirely by transferring ownership. Before Sovereign could formally act, it wasn't just careless bill paying anymore. It was closer to fraud, and it put Sovereign, and by extension, Marcus's own company, at real financial risk if it went through before the lien could be enforced. We need to move fast, Denise Ashworth told him over the phone, real urgency in her voice now. If that sale closes before we perfect our lien, we could lose the ability to recover what we're owed. I've got our attorneys drafting an emergency filing. But Marcus, I think you need to be there in person when we serve it. Whitfield's the kind of man who'll try to talk his way around a lawyer he doesn't know. He needs to understand exactly who he's dealing with. So it was that on a bright Saturday morning 3 weeks after he'd been sent down the service stairs like something to be hidden from the guests, Marcus Doyle drove back out to Cedar Point Marina, not in his rust-spotted work truck this time, but in the gray sedan he used for Belhaven business, wearing a plain button-down shirt instead of coveralls, a folder of legal documents on the passenger seat beside him. He walked past the crew gangway this time. He walked up the main one, past a stunned dockhand who recognized him vaguely but couldn't place from where, and stepped onto the deck of the Corinthian Grace just as Harold Whitfield was hosting what looked like a small brunch for a handful of guests in blazers and sundresses, champagne flutes catching the morning light. Whitfield saw him first and his face did something complicated. Confusion, then irritation, then something closer to alarm as he registered Marcus wasn't wearing coveralls this time, wasn't carrying a toolbox, was instead flanked by a woman in a sharp gray suit carrying a leather folio. What is this? Whitfield said, standing, his brunch guests going quiet around him. I didn't call for service today. Mr. Whitfield, said the woman in the suit, Denise Ashworth, though Whitfield didn't know her yet either. My name is Denise Ashworth, General Manager of Sovereign Yacht Group. This is Marcus Doyle, majority owner of Belhaven Maritime Holdings, Sovereign's parent company. We're here to formally notify you that Sovereign is exercising its lien rights on the Corinthian Grace, effective immediately, pending settlement of your outstanding account, which currently stands at $218,000. We're also aware of an attempted private sale of this vessel currently in progress with a broker, which under the terms of your servicing and refit contract constitutes an unauthorized transfer while an active lien is pending. We have a court order. She held out the folder. Whitfield didn't take it. He was staring at Marcus. Whitfield started, then stopped, his mouth working like he was trying to reassemble a sentence that no longer made sense to him. You're the repairman. I do repair engines, yes, sir. I also happen to own the company that holds the note on this boat. Marcus's voice was calm, almost gentle, the same voice he'd used down in the engine room 3 weeks earlier. I believe we've met. You told me to use the crew stairs. Somewhere behind Whitfield, one of his brunch guests made a small, strangled sound that might have been the start of a laugh, quickly stifled. Delphine Whitfield, standing near the railing in a pale yellow dress, went absolutely white, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. Marcus caught her eye for just a second, and something passed between them, Not triumph exactly, not on his part. Just the quiet settling of a fact that had been true the whole time and was only now becoming visible. This is absurd, Whitfield sputtered. This is clearly some kind of setup, some kind of extortion. I'll have my lawyers look at this immediately. Your lawyers are welcome to review it, Denise said evenly. The lien is properly filed and the court order is valid as of this morning. Until your account is settled in full, this vessel is not to leave the marina, and any sale, transfer, or encumbrance is void under the terms you signed 18 months ago when Sovereign completed your refit financing. I'd recommend reading the paperwork before your lawyers arrive, Mr. Whitfield. It'll save everyone some time. Whitfield's face had gone from pale to a deep, furious red. He turned to Marcus, jabbing a finger toward him, some of his old bluster trying to reassert itself even as his brunch guests began quietly, awkwardly gathering their things. You people, you think you can just walk onto my boat and— It's not your boat, Mr. Whitfield, Marcus said, still quiet, still even. Not until the balance is settled. That's not me being cruel. That's just what's written in the contract you signed. I didn't write those terms to punish you. Mr. Reyes wrote them decades ago to protect people who build and maintain boats from folks who don't pay what they owe. I just happened to be the one standing here today. For a long moment nobody said anything. The brunch guests had gone entirely silent, a few of them already discreetly making their way toward the gangway, murmuring apologies about other engagements. Harold Whitfield stood there in his blazer, in the June heat, on the deck of a boat he could no longer sell, surrounded by people quietly leaving his party. And for the first time since Marcus had met him, he looked less like a man who owned the world and more like a man realizing how small his footing actually was. That it was Delphine who broke the silence, stepping forward from the railing, setting her champagne flute down on a side table with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Mr. Doyle, she said, and there was something different in how she said his name this time, something that had actually been listening. I called your shop 2 weeks ago. I asked you to come fix the engine again, quietly, and you told me to ask my father what he owed. You knew this whole time, and you didn't say anything to me. I wasn't going to embarrass your father in front of his daughter over the phone, Marcus said. Figured it wasn't my place. I told you what I could, that it'd be worth asking him directly. Some things a person's gotta hear from their own family first. Delphine looked at her father, and there was real anger in her face now, not the careless entitlement of the deck 3 weeks ago, but something rawer. You've had us hosting people on a boat you can't afford, over a bill you've been dodging for months, and you let me stand there and humiliate the man who was actually trying to fix it. Do you have any idea how that looks? Delphine, this is not the time. It's exactly the time. Her voice cracked, just slightly, and she turned back to Marcus, something almost pleading in her expression now, though Marcus couldn't yet tell what she was pleading for. Forgiveness, maybe, or just to be seen as separate from the man standing red-faced beside her. I'm sorry for what I said, about the carpet, about the stairs. That wasn't fair. I didn't know who you were, but that shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have mattered either way. It was, Marcus thought, about as honest an apology as he'd ever gotten from someone in her position, and he'd gotten a few over the years, mostly hollow ones offered only once the ground shifted and people realized who they were dealing with. This one had something real in it, he decided, watching her face. Not because it undid the sting of that morning on the deck. Nothing undid that, not fully, but because she'd said it in front of her father, in front of her fleeing brunch guests, with nothing to gain from it anymore since the truth was already out. I appreciate you saying that, Marcus said. It matters more than you might think. Harold Whitfield, watching this exchange, seemed to deflate slightly, some of the fury draining out of his shoulders and being replaced by something closer to exhaustion. What do you want? He said finally, quieter now, addressing Marcus directly. You've made your point. You've had your moment, in front of my guests, in front of my daughter. What is it you actually want from me? I want the account settled, Marcus said simply. That's it. That's the whole thing. I didn't come here to take your boat, Mr. Whitfield, and I'm not looking to ruin you in front of your friends, whatever it might have looked like a minute ago. Sovereign built this vessel. Sovereign's kept her running for 12 years. All I want is what's owed for the work that's been done. The same thing any mechanic, any contractor, any working person wants when they finish a job. Pay what you owe, and this whole lien lifts and you keep your boat. Try to sell her out from under the debt again, and it gets a lot more complicated, a lot faster, and I promise you it won't be complicated in your favor. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, looking at the folder Denise still held out to him, looking at his daughter's face, looking finally, almost reluctantly, at Marcus, really looking at him, maybe for the first time, not as a repairman in coveralls, but as a man who'd just calmly, without raising his voice once, taken every bit of power out of the room. "Give me the paperwork," Whitfield said quietly. He settled the account in full within the week. Marcus later learned it involved selling off a smaller sailboat he kept at a different marina and dipping into a trust he'd been avoiding touching out of pride. And the lien lifted exactly as promised. No drama, no further humiliation, because Marcus genuinely hadn't wanted any of that. He wasn't in the business of grinding people down just because he finally had the leverage to do it. He'd spent too many years on the other side of that particular equation to enjoy wielding it. What he hadn't expected was Delphine Whitfield showing up at his shop 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, driving her own car this time instead of being chauffeured, wearing jeans instead of linen, looking distinctly out of place among the boat lifts and the smell of two-stroke oil. "I know this is strange," she said, standing in the doorway of Doyle's Marine Repair, while Marcus wiped grease from his hands with a shop rag. Renee doing homework at the little desk in the corner where she always sat after school. I wanted to actually see where you work, where you're from. I think I've spent my whole life only ever seeing people like you for about 30 seconds at a time, just long enough to give a direction or complain about something, and I never once thought about what happened after you walked away. I wanted to fix that, a little, if that's all right." Marcus considered her for a moment, then gestured toward the boat up on the lift behind him, a modest little fishing skiff that belonged to a retired schoolteacher who paid him in installments of $40 a month. "Well, you're here now. Might as well see how it's done. Hand me that 10mm socket, would you?" Toolbox on the bench. Delphine looked startled, then, unexpectedly, pleased, and picked up the wrench with the careful uncertainty of someone who had genuinely never held a tool in her life. Renee looked up from her homework and grinned at her father, delighted by the strange sight of the Yacht family's daughter learning to hand over a socket wrench in his little shop. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not the kind where poverty transforms overnight into riches nobody earned, because Marcus had already earned what he had, quietly, over years nobody watched. It wasn't a story about revenge either, because Marcus never once used what he had to humiliate the people who'd humiliated him. He'd had every opportunity to let Harold Whitfield lose the boat entirely, to let the story spread through every marina from Charleston to Savannah about the mechanic who owned the company and let a proud man fall. And he chose not to, because that wasn't who 14 hours in a hurricane, hauling strangers' boats to safety, had made him. What it was, in the end, was a story about a man who never stopped being exactly who he was. Not when he was wading through storm surge for a boat that wasn't his. Not when he was being sent down service stairs like something to be hidden, and not when he finally stood on a deck with the paperwork that could have crushed the man who'd humiliated him and chose instead to simply ask for what was fair. Marcus Doyle kept the shop at Cedar Point running himself, kept fixing engines most weekends because he liked the work more than he liked meetings, kept coaching Renee's softball team, kept the purple and gray bracelet on his wrist until the thread finally wore through 8 months later, at which point Renee, without being asked, made him another one. And somewhere out on the water, most weekends, the Corinthian Grace still sailed, her port engine running smooth and even, her owner a little humbled and a little wiser than before, and her mechanic's number still saved in the family's phone, not under repairman anymore, but under his actual name. Thank you all so much for watching this one all the way through. If this story moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with somebody who needs a reminder that worth was never something you could read off a person's clothes or their hands. We've got more stories just like this one coming, so stay close.